But right now, I'd like to introduce Ryan Colker. Ryan, can you come on up? So for those of you who were here at the DaS Symposium last year, one of the things that we concluded is that we needed to go beyond what we're doing here in this little group and try and formalize some of our goals. And a core committee consisting of Ken, myself, Terry, and Goldberg Hoos from Ford got together, and we founded this thing called the Green Keystone Alliance. And we looked for a home for the Green Keystone Alliance, and we'll get to exactly what this is and what it means, and Ryan's going to do a great job introducing it. But on the advice of our keynote speaker on Saturday, John Veller, we decided that NIST needs to be involved, but NIBS is the better home for it. So we have put the Green Keystone Alliance in the hands of NIBS, which is the National Institute of Building Sciences, and it's being done with the cooperation of the National Institute of Standards and Technologies. And with that, I will introduce Ryan, who is running it at NIBS, to take us from there.
Great. Thanks, Brad. So, as Brad said, I'm pleased to be here to talk about a topic that you identified last year in the symposium. Many of you are probably aware of the buildingSMART Alliance, which is one of the programs at the Institute where I'm from. So I'll talk a little bit about the Institute in a little bit, but I'm going to share with you some thoughts behind the Green Keystone Alliance and the potential path forward. So last year you identified a need for a coordinated approach to sustainable design and establishment of common metrics. So let's take a quick step back and really understand, what is leading sustainability into the corporate lexicon. We have numerous drivers: government regulation, marketing needs, consumer demands, and then there's this idea of, well, what's coming next? So how do we bring these various different drivers into an outcome without totally overburdening our existing system? So first observation is that there's so many current efforts underway, both around green and sustainability, some with a very strong technical basis, and some, frankly, are just plain greenwashing. So without passing any judgment here, here are just a few of the organizations and labels and some other activities that are going on within this space. So it's really important to find the organizations and the leadership that actually, cut through the junk and have the technical expertise to actually make something that's implementable and have valuable results at the end. And if we look at that as a global context, across the economy, I'll get into a little bit of the complexity of various different sectors and how they all fit together. But so this complexity certainly reveals that there's no single organization out there that can really get that big picture. And if that was the case, would we be seeing it organically, throughout the sustainability movement? So the Institute's buildingSMART Alliance is working across the various actors within the building space to develop building information modeling, a framework that can transform the building community into an efficient and cohesive part of the U.S. economy, and then expanding on that work within the building community and the potential for such efficiency and cohesion economy-wide. The Institute is therefore spearheading this effort on the Green Keystone Alliance. And as Brad said, we certainly recognize that we as an organization are highly focused on the building space and needed that expertise from the manufacturing side to really bring that expertise together. So naturally, the National Institute of Standards and Technology was really that place, where a lot of their expertise in manufacturing processes and assisting companies to implement those new processes and procedures. And then also, as Brad mentioned, we've had initial input from some other leading organizations, Gensler and Ford being a couple of those. So let's talk now about what are some of the issues that you identified, and what are some of the things that we've been thinking about in the initial stages here on the Green Keystone Alliance. I probably don't need to tell you that the economy is made up of numerous sectors and subsectors. They often don't talk to one another. And generally, the tools that they develop, the metrics that they use, and the rating systems are developed within their particular spaces. So this is particularly complicated when you get to talk to end products like cars or like buildings, electronics, airplanes. As we talked before, they rely on other sectors, semiconductors, motors, furnishings, power supplies, and really getting all those together. So how do we really look at our national and global goals for things like greenhouse gas emissions, reduced energy use, greater transparency? How can we really understand where we are as an economy, as a country, and then globally? How do we put that all together to really figure out what is our total impact? So probably the best way to do this is to think about it as a narrative. So let's take an example of a specific gear. Let's say this gear is, or one kind of similar, used in two sectors. Let's say automotive and aerospace. So we have 3 suppliers in the space. One of them actually serves both sectors. One only serves the automotive, and one serves the aerospace. Each of the sectors and even the manufacturers within those sectors require different information about those gears, which then the supplier is on the hook to provide. So you can see how suppliers could be reluctant to enter new markets. Basically because of that burden of supplying different information depending on who's asking. And then we have those regulators who have different questions, but they still need answers. So how do we determine the total environmental impact of an end product that contains thousands of parts? So here's a graphical representation of what I just discussed. So we have 4 end product manufacturers and 2 regulators who are looking for different types of information about our specific gear. And so these attributes can represent everything from environmental impact like carbon emissions, global warming potential, ozone depletion, hazardous materials, anything else that we may care about. So then we get to the end product. Let's say in this case a car. So we have our gear, but then we also have things like the battery, steering wheel, gaskets, and spark plugs. And they all have various stories, but they all resemble the stories of our original gear. So how can we credibly report what the total impact of the car is? And then how can we make choices about the various different design aspects of the car? We can probably right now say, I put a larger gear in, that means, maybe I could have a smaller engine. But what does that really mean when we go back to the various different aspects that we're talking about earlier? What does that mean for hazardous materials? What does that mean for greenhouse gas emissions? What does that mean for cost? No, I can go forward. In prior activities not specifically focused on the sustainability question, researchers found that a $1 reduction in cost from the supply chain can result in an equivalent of $12 increase in revenue. So on the sustainability side, we've identified the need for that green keystone, which is basically a decoder ring. Allows us to wrap up all that important information about the individual components, get to an end product with the lowest environmental impact, would allow manufacturers to extract data from various different sources to reduce the data sets in response to specific needs, whether that's new regulation or specific certification schemes for your various different sector. We saw variations of this kind of concept earlier today, but naturally, if you make the decisions early on, you have a greater impact down the line throughout the life cycle of the product. So we really should be targeting the point where we can make that greatest impact, and that's the space that a lot of you deal in. So knowing the information we need is really what's important to help make that decision. So we're starting to see some of the progress in this area in the building sector. we can provide information about a building's orientation, its insulation, mechanical equipment, and even occupancy, and then model the anticipated energy use once constructed. That's not perfect, but we're at least starting down that road. And so then we can make choices on changing the various different aspects and understanding what that means for the building's actual energy use. And if they so choose, which Angela pointed out earlier, they can make choices on those modeled results. Do I want something different in my building? So then let's take a look at buildings as one of those other potential sectors where a green keystone could be useful. So when we talk about buildings, we talk about things like concrete, windows, solar panels, furnaces, bricks. So how do we really know how they come together and bring the important attributes of that building to the fore? And then we can even take one step larger and then consider the end products that a company produces, its buildings and facilities, its transportation, its business infrastructure, and the energy inputs. And how does that come together to really define what are the important attributes of a corporation? We're seeing a little bit of this on the federal government side. Through an executive order, they're required to do a comprehensive inventory of their greenhouse gas emissions. So here you see your Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. So we can really think that this may be something that we may see an economy-wide attempt in the future. And how do we really get that aggregation of information across the various different companies, products, and really understand, well, what is our total global greenhouse gas emissions, and how does our country fit into that assessment? So some of the work already undertaken at NIST in its manufacturing interoperability program, which has since been wrapped up, but they continue a lot of the associated efforts there. We have several key barriers and needs that have been identified to reach true interoperability. And so let me give you their definition of interoperability. The ability of applications and systems to share information and exchange services with each other based on standards and to cooperate in processes using the information and services. So while not specifically focused on sustainability, many of these barriers and needs certainly form the basis for the establishment of the Green Keystone Alliance. So these include the notion that diverse sectors have common integration needs, but overlapping standards inhibit their adoption. So that brings us to the conclusion that we need cross-cutting enablers to have the potential for greater impact. So with our current diverse sustainability environment, we may be at some sort of impasse. So we have companies that will not buy standard solutions without a market, and software providers need the industry to make the market for the standard before they'll invest money to implement it. So an attempt must be made to bring many of these factors together. So if we solve the Green Keystone, how can we benefit individual companies, the economy, and regulators? So we need tools and practices that can remove inefficiencies in matching regulation with technology and products. Decisions can be made early in the design process where you can get the greatest bang for the buck, and then can facilitate the use of integrated design tools. Regulators can then speak the same language as manufacturers and actually work together to achieve the desired results at the lowest cost. So if we go back to our gear, where 3 manufacturers can make it, but 2 suppliers avoid the new market because of some of the reporting hurdles, we can now specify the best product at the lowest cost because we have that information readily available that each of the sectors desires. Doesn't get to the earlier question of, well, do we trust that supplier, but that's another issue altogether. So now you're probably thinking, well, this is a great, worthwhile effort, but how are they going to do it? I'll say it will only happen with the full cooperation and participation of numerous actors, software developers and providers for the design and engineering community, LCA tool providers, manufacturers, researchers, government, and standards developers all must be at the table. So we're looking at three initial goals. The first is to advocate coordination and harmonization of regulations and standards for the gathering, disclosing, and transmitting of sustainability and life cycle inventory information across sectors and within supply chains. We're also looking to support an economy-wide initiative to develop standards and protocols for collecting and delivering life cycle inventory information. And then third, developing the guidance and support development of standards for aggregation of all life cycle information from original material extraction to final sale and eventually full cradle-to-cradle accounting. So as you can guess, a roadmap for accomplishing these goals is important. So once a critical mass of participants from the diverse sectors and interest groups indicate their willingness to move forward, we'll form a council within the National Institute of Building Sciences, similar to the existing buildingSMART Alliance. And, of course, naturally, this takes funding. And, certainly the funding for such an effort should come from all those who will benefit. But as you can guess, it's a very diverse community that would benefit in the very end, which leads us to the question of, well, what is government's role? So with the recent focus on eliminating or streamlining regulations to encourage business activities, this may actually be a time that's ripe for funding. However, we need to convince policymakers to make the initial expenditure, which is certainly a tough task in today's environment. We've already begun promoting the value of building information modeling to policymakers and how it can make compliance more efficient. So we're moving down that path now. So basically, the bottom line is we need your participation, your commitment, and your expertise to make this transformation real. I look forward to the discussion this afternoon, and please let me know if you're interested in participating in this effort. Thank you.
I want to add a few points to that. First of all, you saw in, I think, Ryan's second slide, all of those different organizations and entities that have their own domain. It's not the goal of the Green Keystone Alliance to supersede any of them. The idea here is to be a facilitating and an enabling organization to make what they impose on their members or what they impose on those who they regulate to be easier to comply with and more effective at getting their goals met. So that's the first point. And the second point is, this is not about us going through and trying to impose anything on anybody. It's the Green Keystone Alliance role is to facilitate, coordinate, educate, and collaborate. The bottom line here for the first point is to reduce the cost to industry to provide better, more sustainable products, not just on the compliance side, but also to reduce their cost to keep track of what's going on, and so to increase the information that's available. Questions?
How can we not get overwhelmed?
That is certainly a huge challenge. But one of the things that we're certainly struggling with is, well, really, what is the key information we need, and what is the key information we don't need? And certain sectors have ideas of what that information is for their sectors, but when we start looking at it at an economy-wide basis, what do we really care about? And, how do we translate the background stuff into those metrics that we really do care about? It's certainly going to be an overwhelming process. But that's where, tools like software and other things can really do that stuff and at the end of the day, actually have something that is useful, across the board.
Am I seeing kind of a green Keystone seal of approval for the data that is supplied with a product is sort of the end result here, that this is in compliance with the needs of industry? And is there some kind of time frame attached to this initiative?
I wouldn't necessarily say we're looking at any sort of certification thing or anything like that. It's really understanding what is the data that's currently out there, and how do we put it into a format that's useful for regulators, manufacturers, and how do we have that translation across the various different sectors. I indicated earlier, we have the car as an example. We heard earlier about efforts on boards for computers, but those things appear everywhere. So when we put them in a car, does the car manufacturer really care about the various different attributes of that board, which the computer manufacturers have said is important to them? And so that's the kind of thing that we really need to figure out, is where that data is, what's important, and how do we get it into a format that is useful across the economy.
The bottom line on the DaS Symposium is how do we as a software industry enable our customers to make better and more informed decisions at more stages in the process. The purpose of the Green Keystone Alliance is to, behind the scenes, making those decisions easier. And it's in support of that the collaborative efforts are being put forth. Ashin?
So you're talking about combining sort of the efforts of industry and academia and regulatory functions, but I think that one of the key challenges is that the goals of each of those institutional bodies is often really different and sometimes at odds. So how do you take those different goals and sort of integrate them into one actual end function?
So the idea is not to really look at those goals. It's not, we don't care, whether the EPA wants to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. That's not really the question. The question is, how do we provide them the information they need to have that result at the end? So, you as a product manufacturer still have that requirement to report to the EPA on, say, greenhouse gas emissions. And how do you do that in a way that you're not creating a new system to develop that information to then pass it to the EPA?
Jack?
What leads you to believe that information is what they need? Since they have more information than they're acting on now. Well, this strikes me, no offense, I don't want to dampen but this strikes me as the same strategy Mother Nature used to sustain dinosaurs. It isn't the lack of information, it's the lack of thinking that is got us boxed up. And in the systems world, there's this notion of requisite variety. And if you set out to facilitate regulation of X, then you damn well better have more variety than X is going to exhibit. And I think we've got to do some more skull stations here to make sure that we're not interfering with the world rather than improving it.
So the first point is information is critical, but it's not the only part of the efforts for the Green Keystone Alliance. It's facilitating their understanding of what the requirements are outside of their domain, so that when they try to impose something, they can take into account some of the bigger picture that they work within. It is about coordinating their efforts and collecting it. There are actually 3 stages to this. The third stage of this is I always call it a value-added information tax, that whenever you pass something along, you provide the information about it along with it, and then you carry that forward. But it's not just about the information.
Well, I just simply caution that this notion of helping them understand the requirements is the problem. There are no valid requirements. A whole new way of thinking is required to get on top of this problem. And Doc is, I think, trying to get people's level of consciousness up to where they see that it's going to take more than informed regulation to get on top of this situation.
Which is actually a really good lead-in to our lunch keynote. So with that, Ryan, I want to thank you.
Thank you.